Welcome to this episode of the Bible Toolbox. I'm Lydia.
And I'm Luke, and we are here to help you enjoy the Bible through the tools that scholars and programmers have created for you. And we are here with another interview with Hampton Keathley, who is the co-founder of Bible.org, and we'll talk more about that. So welcome, Hampton.
Thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
So let's start with just tell us about yourself and your background.
Okay. Well, my dad was a pastor in a little town of Lufkin, Texas, East Texas. And he went to Dallas Theological Seminary in the early 60s. And his style was very in-depth teaching and, things like the Greek word literally means, whatever, or very verse by verse, which is the style of most DTS pastors. Everyone took notes. And my dad taught 3 guys Greek when I was 13. And so I sat in on that Tuesday morning breakfast and learned Greek early on. And I was friends with a guy named Joe Head. I was 15. He was 19. During summers, he would come back from A&M, and I dated his cousin. And so we would go water skiing and sailing on Lake Sam Rayburn every Saturday, just about, for 3 summers. And I mention him because he'll be important later. So then I went off to A&M, was in the Air Force for 6 years. And then while I was in Germany, I started teaching Sunday school at the church. And I actually used those notes I took when I was in high school from my dad. But I also bought some commentaries, and I would read the 3 commentaries on James and get 3 opinions. And I was frustrated with not being able to decide who was telling what was the correct interpretation. Mm-hmm. So I had this idea that maybe I should go to seminary and get all the right answers.
And so, they have all of them.
Yes.
All the right answers. Yeah.
So I left in 1990, the day before Saddam invaded Kuwait. It was my last day in the Air Force.
Oh, wow.
And so I missed all of that. I moved to Dallas and started school. And I had become sort of a computer geek, self-taught, just like messing around with computers the last couple of years in the Air Force. And when I started seminary, Windows users could not type in Greek and Hebrew. Oh. And rather than buying a Mac, I bought a little $100 font program, and I made Greek and Hebrew fonts and transliteration fonts. Made some word macros for typing backwards, right to left in Hebrew. And I turned my paper in class one day with Greek typed in, and the fellow student said, "How'd you type in Greek?"
So much jealousy there, I'm sure.
Yeah, because you used to have to leave a blank space and write in your Greek.
Right.
Okay.
And so I said, "Well, I have a font package I'll sell you."
Nice.
And so Galaxy Software was born. That was 91. I live on Galaxy Road.
Wow.
And I called the package Bible Script. Well, my friend Joe had moved to Dallas, and we had reconnected, and he had a networking business that he had started. And he encouraged me to run ads for that font package in Windows Magazine. So I call up Windows Magazine, and it was $800 for a quarter-page ad.
Wow.
So next time we went to lunch, I said, "Joe, I can't afford that." And he's like, "You run the ad. If it doesn't pay for itself, I'll pay for it."
Wow.
I'm like, okay. So I ran the ad, and it paid for itself. And so I made a couple $1,000s a month, after paying for the ad, and that paid the bills while I went to seminary.
Wow.
And then he took me to ETS. Joe took me to ETS that year. Are you familiar with the Evangel? There's a meeting that happens every year somewhere USA, San Francisco or Kansas City or Orlando or DC.
It's in Denver this year.
It's in Denver this year, yes. And so I called him one day and I said, or he called me and says, "Hey, I just realized you have fonts to sell. Let's go to San Francisco." So he bought me a last minute ticket. We hopped on a plane and flew to San Francisco, and he got a booth to sell fonts. And it was at that time that I met the Logos guys and became their font guy for a few years.
Oh, cool.
Like Logos,
And
the Bible software.
yeah, Bible
Just for
software
people who don't
Logos.
know.
So that was all 91, 92. And in 94, I had gotten the idea that seminary journals ought to be on CD so you could search them. And so Joe had given me stock in this company and I sold some of it. I bought a $4,000 1X CD burner and a $4,000 software package and a $1,500 scanner that would do 1 page per minute. And I started cutting up Bibliotheca Sacra journals. That's Dallas Seminary's journal. And by the end of 94, I had finished my first CD. And Joe's actually over at my house, and I showed him my CD. And he said, you know, we need somebody to do this stuff at our company, publish our journals or manuals. And so at that conversation, he and I were talking about the internet and that there's no good material Bible study stuff on the internet. And he said, yeah, I've been thinking about that. We ought to start a website. And so November 94, Bible.org became a concept. And although we hadn't registered the domain. So I got a job at his company, being their electronic publisher. I started their website. I now knew a little bit about web stuff. I registered Bible.org for $35 and started Bible.org on the same server that I was, doing the other stuff. And right away, we decided that we needed a Bible on Bible.org. So we called Zondervan and they said no. And we called Lockman Foundation and they said no. And so
that would be the NIV and the NASB, right?
Right. Yeah. The NIV and the New American Standard. So we were at the ETS meeting in Philadelphia in November 95. And I guess Dan Wallace and Hall Harris and Darrell Bach, those are 3 New Testament professors from Dallas Seminary. And my friend Joe and my dad and Greg, my friend from Canada, we were all sitting around lamenting the fact that we couldn't put a Bible on Bible.org because of copyright restrictions.
Okay. Were there any Bibles online at that point?
There were no Bibles online.
Okay.
King James, I'm not even sure. Wheaton, ccel.wheaton.edu, I think was about the only website. And pretty much all that was on there was like old church father stuff.
Interesting.
So at that meeting, we discussed, should we take like an old ASV and spruce it up and publish that, put that on Bible.org? And the consensus was that it's, too old, too literal. And, so we basically came to the conclusion that we should just start from scratch from Greek and Hebrew and do a brand new Bible translation for the internet that would be free for everyone to use. Wow. And so the Net Bible really comes from the fact that it was the first Bible on the internet. And
nice. Clever name.
And so since then, people have, we put NET, New English Translation, but we don't use it. We never call it the NET and we never call it New English Translation. We just call it the Net Bible. Okay. So, and at that meeting, I think it was at that meeting, Joe asked the question of the guys. I always wonder when that pastor standing up there with the 2 or 4 year degree says, I think the translators missed it here. I said, I wonder why they think they know more than Prof. So-and-so who taught Hebrew and Jeremiah for 35 years and then translated Jeremiah for NIV and NLT or whatever. Mm-hmm. And why did they think they know more? So could you put some footnotes in there explaining your logic behind, if it's a debatable passage? And so we ended up with over 60,000 footnotes, and it was never supposed to be printed. But then people were, saying we would like, a printed version. So then we had to print it. But I would like to point out that when we started putting the Bible online, the other publishers were like, if the only modern translation online is the Net, then they're going to, become more popular. So I feel like we were probably the catalyst that forced the other translators, other translations online. So
I just like can't even fathom that. No Bibles online.
I know.
It's just
This is the early
makes
days.
sense.
Yeah. So we were a bunch of computer geeks, and we were used to, in the late 90s, having beta software.
Mhm.
And so we had the idea maybe we could print a beta Bible. And so we did the first beta edition of the Net Bible in 2001. And the idea was just, go to this website and report errors that you found, and questions that you have. And we're still working on it, but you can, take this 4-pound Bible to church with you if you want.
That's how heavy it was? 4 pounds?
Yes. Actually, if it was a little over 4 pounds, and that cost us a whole bunch more money shipping Bibles.
Oh, I'm sure.
So we had to get the font smaller and thinner paper so we could get under 4 pounds. But speaking of beta versions, one of my favorite stories is I got a call one day here in my upstairs office, and a person says, I was wondering what the 800 number is in the footnote on the promiscuous woman in Proverbs chapter 2. And I was like, what? Todd, call this, he's sitting over here behind me. Todd, call that number. We look it up, and he calls it. It was First Union Visa. I'm like, how did this get here? And it was only a few weeks later, I was driving around the loop here in Dallas, and Chuck Swindoll was on the radio, and he was in Proverbs. And when he gets to that passage, he says, I especially like the Net Bible translation in this passage because it has the woman's 800 number in the footnote. And so our phone rang off the wall, and people were like, I want to buy one of those Bibles with the 800 number. Well, we have a second beta edition out that's smaller and better. No, I want the one with the 800. So I tracked it down. The guy who did the translation for Proverbs was working on Proverbs one night or one evening. He gets a phone call from First Union Visa with a special credit card offer, and he was interested, and he goes, I have to leave. Can I get your number and call you back?
No.
He can't find a pen. And so he just types it in, hits save, and he and his wife head off to whatever thing they were going to. And it made it through all the proofreading.
That is hilarious. Wow.
So anyway, the first beta edition had the lady's phone number in it. So we did a first beta in 2001, a second beta edition in 2003. Then we blessed it and called it and had a first edition in 2006.
Okay.
And so it was 2018 that we came out with our second edition. And the things that would change is, for example, in the first edition we had the word, so and so had sexual intercourse with so and so, and other translations had slept with. And so at the time, we thought it was a good idea, but later on we were like, if the Hebrew used a euphemism, maybe we should use a euphemism. So we changed some of that. And we had a lot of feedback from people. And so we would take the feedback and we would go to the scholars and say, they have a question here. Should we word this differently? Should we add a note explaining better why we did what we did? So it was never a common consensus Bible, but we did take a lot of user feedback to help improve it. And then in 2018, we did the second edition. And then right about the time the Bibles were arriving off the boat, Zondervan called and said, we want to license the Net Bible.
Oh, wow.
So we met with Zondervan and Thomas Nelson and HarperCollins people, because HarperCollins owns Zondervan and Thomas Nelson, and decided to let them start printing it so that we could get out of the printing business.
Okay.
So my job now is pretty much working with the HarperCollins people and getting feedback from users, updating the text or the notes when it's needed. And just this week, I had somebody, email and saying the word Holy Spirit, holy is not capitalized in the footnote in Isaiah 63. is that a mistake or on purpose? So I tracked down Paul Harris. Are we supposed to, is this supposed to be capitalized? He goes like, so we still are updating things like that.
And that's the benefit of it being online, is you can just keep
Right.
updating it like that. You don't have to print a whole new Bible for it to go through.
Yeah. So I will update the database, and then we can run a command and we can push it out to the online version and have all the latest changes. And then we have a log of what I changed, and I can send that to Harper Collins. And then when they go to print, they can say, okay, he changed this, these 30 things in the past year or something like that.
Okay. How often do they print new NET Bibles?
Well, I don't know exactly. They haven't asked for new files from me for a year and a half, I guess.
Okay.
But what they do print, or they'll do like the Abide Bible, which will have a different set of notes. And so I have to manage the translate, and we'll get into this in a minute, but I have to manage the different types of notes.
Okay.
Translator notes, text critical notes, study notes, Abide notes, limited notes, so we, depending on what they want to print, you can't print a large print Bible with 60,000 notes. So they go, we need the limited set of notes for this one.
So what I'm hearing is you would recommend the online version for ease of use. And
yes, and we actually have an iPhone app that has all the notes, and it's free.
Okay.
And so you can get the Net Bible on your phone. And so anyway.
Cool.
So that's how the Net Bible came to be.
Wow. What a journey.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so right now we're kind of talking through different study Bibles. And so this is kind of why we're including the Net Bible along with those, even though, it's a translation, but the footnotes are so awesome that it's basically a study Bible as well.
Yeah.
So why don't you demonstrate some about the Bible, Bible.org and netbible.org, and how we can use it.
Okay. Before we do that, I would like to point out what's kind of unique about the Net Bible.
Okay.
Sure.
There's probably three things you should, that make Bibles different. One is, are they dynamic versus literal?
Is that word for word, thought for thought? Right?
Yeah.
We talked about.
And there's a real misconception out there that literal translations are more accurate, that, word for word translations are more accurate. You told me, I think the other day when we talked, that you interviewed Mark Strauss.
Yep.
So did he go through his discussion about the word fresh?
He didn't. No.
He's got a book called Distorting Scripture. And he says, the word fresh has a dozen meanings. I'm eating fresh fruit, which is not rotten or not canned. I'm drinking fresh water, which is not salty. I want fresh linens, which just means washed, laundered. She had a fresh face. He was fresh with her. The general wanted fresh troops, And so what's the literal meaning of the word fresh? Well, it depends on the context. And so every translation has to be, interpreted. And then the question is, are you going to put it into smooth English or wooden English? And that's really the difference between the dynamic versus the literal. So the Net Bible is on the more dynamic end of the spectrum. Another thing to think of, another thing is, does the translation use New Testament knowledge and passages to translate the Old Testament passages? Okay. So if I'm reading Isaiah 7:14, says, does it say a virgin will be with child or a young woman? Well, if I don't know anything about Matthew, then I'm going to think young woman in the context of Isaiah. So I should not translate it virgin, because that's not a specific virgin. In 700 BC, they weren't thinking of a virgin prophecy for the Messiah. Okay.
Is the word ambiguous? It could go either way.
It could.
Okay.
And so, but he's talking about a lady that is standing over on the sidelines. She's probably already pregnant. That's how that phrases normally translated. And he says, you know, first directly to her, you will name your child Emmanuel. And so there's an immediate context that everybody would have just been thinking about. Now, is there a hidden prophecy? Then yes. And we know that when we get to Matthew. But how do I translate the Old Testament passage? Or like in Genesis 3:15, is it bruise and crush language? Or is it just strike and strike? It's the same Hebrew word. It's not till Romans and the progress of Revelation that you know that there's crushing the head and bruising the heel, you know, kind of language going on. So we probably shouldn't translate it crush and bruise, you know, in that passage. There aren't a lot of passages that this affects, but a few. So we don't use the New Testament to translate the Old. We keep it in its context. What did the original audience understand? And then another big one is gender inclusive language. And so biblical languages, cultures were male, you know, he meant he and she, you know, so not so much these days. So there's the need to be more accurate, because when the hailstones fell, they just didn't fall on men, males, they fell on people. And so, you know, you have to look at each situation and go, do I translate this as people, person, or is this specifically a male passage? Son of man. Okay, well, we need to keep that probably, you know, because that's significant.
Yeah.
So we consider ourselves gender accurate, and we passed the test with the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. They thought we did it right. Okay. So those are three things, but I think what makes the Net Bible unique is its transparency. And that brings us up to the notes, because we explain, you know, what's going on.
Yeah, that's a good word.
So let me share my screen. So this is netbible.org. One of our programmers years ago wrote this whole thing for us as a study environment to use the Net Bible. And I'm going to give a little tour. I'm going to make the font bigger here. Can you read it?
Yep.
Okay. So there are three types of notes in the Net Bible. There's translator notes, which will give you some things like grammatical reasons for the way we translated something. So we could go to Ephesians chapter 4, verse 9. Now, what is the meaning of he ascended, except that he also descended to the lower regions, namely the earth? There we go. First, number 10, footnote number 10 says the translator's note is going to explain why we translated this namely instead of the lower parts of the earth, because that's the traditional translation. So to the lower parts of the earth, the phrase has been variously interpreted. First, the traditional view understands it as a reference to the underworld or hell, where Jesus is thought to have descended in the 3 days between his death and resurrection. In this case, of the earth would be a partitive genitive. A second option is to translate the phrase of the earth as a genitive of apposition to the lower parts, namely the earth, as in the present translation. So example, RSV went with number 1. The ESV changed it to number 2.
Okay.
A third option, which also sees the phrase of the earth as a genitive of apposition, is the descent in the passage occurs after the ascent rather than before it. And he goes on to explain that. So you can see that you kind of get into some of the Greek grammar and, you know, to explain why we went with the appositional understanding. Another one, for example, this is probably one that my friend Joe would have asked a question about. Verse 19, Matthew 28:19. Therefore go How many times have you heard someone say, well, this could be or should be translated while you're going, right? Actually, it can't be. And so we tell you in the footnote that, why. This is an attendant circumstance participle with an aorist imperative verb. So again, it gets kind of technical, but there's a reason that this is an actual command and not a translated like normal participle.
Okay. So
those
TN stands for translator notes?
Yes. So TNs are translator notes having to do with why we translated the way we did. And we try to give, the options and so you can see what others did. Let's see, study notes. Do we have one right here? Okay, so this is more like a Ryrie study Bible note or something like that. So in I am with you, this is a comment here, Matthew's gospel begins with the prophecy of the Savior's name would be Emmanuel, God with us. And so it's, mentioning other related passages or the meaning of the text. Okay. And then text critical note is there's 5,800 plus Greek manuscripts, and they don't all agree. And so we go into detail there to say why we think that, the text should be read this way. Let me see if I can find Mark 1:14. Jesus went into Galilee and proclaimed the gospel of God. The King James, I can co-parallel here. The King James, New King James said the gospel of the kingdom of God. So we have a TC note, text critical note, that explain most witnesses' manuscripts, and then we list them. And so we have the papyri and the majuscules and the minuscules and all that. Again, it gets technical.
Wow.
And so that will explain why we think, from external and internal criticism, why we think this is the best text.
Yeah. And even the NET has a appendix, right, that explains.
Yes, we have an appendix that lists all of the different resources that we used.
Okay.
So it's kind of confusing. I have been putting together a video series. I haven't posted yet, but where I go through and I explain the text critical notes and what each of those mean. Like that's Latin and this is Syriac and I think this is Origin. And so do
you think you would ever get to the point where each of those manuscripts would be linked to like a little description of what they are?
Oh, goodness.
It's a big job.
Yes, that would be a huge job. But yeah, that's a good idea. Like with Perl, I can do that. With all things are possible with Perl. Perl is a programming language.
Okay.
And I learned it making journals and converting journals to different formats like Logos Bible software. And so I use it all the time with the Net Bible. And so I can read the whole Bible in from the database and search and replace and spit it out in the Logos format or the format that HarperCollins needs. And so that would be a project for Perl to search for all of those characters and add links to those things.
Yeah.
So it looks like the blue
these
numbers
are
footnotes.
let me give a tour of the netbible.org study tool. So we have a quick way to get to book and chapter, and so then you can just read, and if you click on a footnote over here, then it'll take you to the footnote. You could parallel scroll another translation. Actually, I don't know if it parallel scrolls, but you can manually parallel scroll it. Or you can go to the Greek, and if you hover over the word, then it will give you the corresponding Greek word. And down at the bottom, I don't want to move my mouse, but at the bottom you can see the definition. And if I hover over it over here, it gives me the Strong's number. And I could go up here and do a search and type in Strong : and then the number.
Mm-hmm.
Or I can type in marriage, and then it'll tell me the list of places in the Bible. I could narrow down and say I only want to know places in the Old or New Testament or in a specific book. This I just learned a couple days ago. It's broken. It's only showing unpublished stuff on Bible.org, so we're working on that. This shows the word marriage in the footnotes, and this actually shows all the places marriage occurs in the Theological Journal Library.
Wow.
And those are, you can...
If you have a subscription to the Galaxy Software Theological Journal Library, then you can actually come up here and go to your settings, type in your Galaxy Software username and password, and then you actually can access all of that from here.
Cool.
And then library shows this is a Romans thing, so we flagged everything on Bible.org with book of the Bible that it's about or topic. And so this pulls up, corresponding stuff that's on Romans or Romans 5. That's
posted on Bible.org.
Yes.
Okay.
So I could click on that and it would take me over to that study on Bible.org. So on Bible.org, you can come in here and say, I want to see everything you have on a book of the Bible, like Luke. And we have a curated list of what we think are the better things on Bible.org and on the net. And then we just have an exhaustive list of everything that's on Bible.org on Luke. And we actually have a lot of stuff in other languages. People volunteer to translate. And so they send us what they've translated, and then we convert it and post it. So you can study by author. If you have a favorite author, you could come in here and say, well, I want to see Dan Wallace's articles. And so you could come down here and find him and see series that he's done, History of the English Bible, and you could read the series. Or you can, like I said, you can go by book or author, or you could search for a verse, and every verse on Bible.org is indexed. So if you did a verse search, it would show more, the way things are written, 1 Peter with an FIRST or a Roman numeral 1 or a number 1, and it's abbreviated, PET or 1PE. I mean, just plain text searches for Bible verses are not very accurate. So,
but this one accounts for all of those variations.
Yes. So when we flag and tag our verses, then we look for all that.
Wow, that is so much resources and work on your end, and
I think I think we got about 20,000 sermons, maybe more than that by now. But and these are not 3 points and a poem sermons. These are in-depth commentary like sermons. And then there was one other thing I forgot to mention. Notes. Tom Constable is a professor at Dallas Seminary, and he did several 100-page commentaries on, Genesis, Exodus, every book of the Bible.
Oh, wow.
So I digitized, I worked with a person at his church, and we digitized his notes and then converted them so that we tagged all the verses. So, goes right to the right verse. And so this parallel scrolls with your Bible. So it's like a running commentary for free.
Wow, nice.
And then, you can click daily, and this will tell you what you should be reading on September 3rd if you're reading through the Bible in a year.
Okay.
And if we have audio for that, you can click that, and it'll read that chapter to you. You can share it, show your bookmarks. You can come over here to your notes, and you can add a note. If I click, for example, here, I can say, add a note and take a note. And then my iPhone app will sync if we're both logged in.
Okay.
So I can
you can create an account and then all of your own notes are saved.
Right.
Okay. And that's all free?
Uh-huh.
Wow.
And then you can come here for click on it and click parallel, and then this will give you the net,
Okay.
NIV, New American Standard, ESV, NLT, and so you can compare multiple translations.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a fairly decent Bible study tool, and it's all free. And
it's very accessible too. Like I think anybody could navigate this and use it and find it helpful.
Yeah. We had a guy named Brian Seagraves who worked for us, and a very smart programmer, and he wrote all of this and still helps maintain it when things break. So we've been emailing this week trying to figure out why our search is broken. But anyway,
okay.
So that's the netbible.org site. And then we kind of poked around on the bible.org site.
Mm-hmm.
So
awesome.
That's great. Thanks for that tour.
Yeah. So how do you personally use this tool?
Well, although I have the very expensive Logos Bible software, I find that half the time, or more than half the time, I just come here. My browser's already open. It's bookmarked. So I jump in here, and then you need to look up a verse. I'll use the daily reading sometimes, try to read through the Bible each year. And it's nice to, when I'm reading, I notice things like, well, why did we say it that way? Being involved in the Bible translation process has been a curse and a blessing. Our church uses the ESV. I haven't converted them yet. But they'll read from the ESV, and I'll be reading from the net, and I'll go, why did we translate that, that way? Mm-hmm. So then I'll come up here, and I will use the parallel thing to quickly get a comparison of the different ways things were translated. Mm-hmm. And our search, I will point out, is a little bit different. When you memorize a passage of scripture in the New American Standard, and then you switch to the NIV after 10 years of using, or 20 years of using the New American Standard, and use the new NIV for 20 years, and then you switch to something else, the net or whatever. And then you go, there's a verse that says, and you can't remember exactly what it says, and you mix a little of your New American Standard with your NIV, and you search. Well, our search searches all the translations for all the words and comes back with you probably meant this one. Okay. Because you just mixed a King James word and a New American Standard word. And so that is a pretty good search. And so I use that too.
Mm-hmm. So aside from like reading it to find errors and like trying to be both like in the word and yet update the word and all of that, how do you personally study the Bible? Like what's your personal devotions, and how do you stay fed spiritually? Well,
I do try to read through the Bible each year. And like I said, I use this sometimes to keep up with that. Where should I be? Sometimes I get ahead, sometimes I get behind. I find that I get sidetracked with, translation issues. And so I'll be off writing. I've spent quite a bit of time writing an article recently on David slept with his fathers in 1 Kings chapter 2. It says Wayne Grudem wrote an article saying that these dynamic translations have missed the rich metaphor of sleep for death, by which we have a hint of future resurrection and corporate reuniting with his ancestors. And I'm like, wow, did we really mess up? We said David passed away. NLT said David died. I'm like about to call Hall Harris and say, Hall, should we change this? But then I go, well, let me do some research. Well, it turns out that's just a euphemism and it's an idiom. And there are people out there who think that it's a resurrection passage. And there's no hint of resurrection. If I said I put my dog to sleep, you're not going to think that he's going to be resurrected. It's just a euphemism. And there are actually people who use those passages. And so that's, I'll find myself, looking at the logical, lexical, and theological problems with what he just said and writing an article. And so that's kind of where my focus has been. And, putting together a series on dynamic versus literal translations. And I've, taught that at a couple churches. And so that's kind of been my focus for recent years, is the self-proclaimed advocate for the Net Bible and the dynamic translations. So.
Okay. Any more questions?
I don't think so. Anything else you want to add before we close out?
No, I think that covers it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for this. And this was really helpful to give an overview of this tool. And I think one of the biggest problems in the world is that more Christians don't use the NET footnotes. So they're so helpful.
They're a very, very rich resource. And that's, I think the translation itself is very good. It's not the only thing that I use. I got a story. I was at an ETS exhibit hall selling Net Bibles several years ago, and first editions. And I had my Net Bible shirt on, and I wandered around to the other booths. And I went to buy the Tyndale booth, and I'm looking at what the NLT and other things. And the guy goes, "Oh, you're with the Net Bible. I love the Net Bible. I read my Net Bible to my kids every night."
Okay.
And I go, "Really? I read the NLT to my kids every night." And it goes back to the age of my kids and the sexual intercourse passages. And I was like, I don't feel like explaining this to my kids. Let's read the NLT. And so anyway.
Yeah. I think your resources can help us love the Bible more and enjoy it and understand it. And yeah. So thanks for creating this for us. For helping create it.
Well, you bet. Glad to do it.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Bible Toolbox. Visit our website at thebibletoolbox.com for more information and resources about the content. Be sure to contact us with suggestions of any tools you'd like us to review.
And thank you to those who support us on Patreon and who have reached out with encouraging messages. We couldn't do it without you.